So how do we navigate this? Honestly, together, one story at a time. Today, we are focusing in on elections. We are wrapping up the biggest election year in history. It wasn't just the US. More than 4 billion people in over 60 countries had the chance to vote. What role did misinformation and disinformation play at the polls? We've got our expert panel ready to go on this. Craig Silverman back with us. He covers misinformation at ProPublica, a heavy focus on the US election. And Gabrielle Lim is a doctoral fellow from the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto. Her research focuses on Southeast Asia. Great to have you both.
Thank you.
Craig, I got to start with you. We got to talk about the massive election for our neighbors to the south. How pervasive was misinformation and disinformation?
I think at this point you could kind of say it's just sort of baked in to the politics. It's true in the US, and I think it's true in a lot of other countries around the world, and part of that is the way people are getting their information. It's a much more open environment, which is great, more voices, but that creates opportunities for manipulation. And so, you know, one of the things I think a lot of people are watching for this year was what role might deepfakes play. So, you know, faked audio, faked video. We did see an example of a robocall in the United States that used Joe Biden's voice, but it wasn't actually Joe Biden. And so that gave people misleading information. Their news that actually just came out after the election was that there was a series of ads run on Google and on Meta's platforms like Facebook, where they actually pretended like the ads were coming from the Kamala Harris campaign, but they didn't. They were coming from a sort of pro-Trump PAC, and they ran ads, for example, targeting the Muslim population in the US, talking about how much she supports Israel. And so they were including false claims and misleading information to really drive people away from her. So there were lots of examples. It's baked in, it's a part of it, and part of that is it does come from, at times, the candidates, the campaigns, but also lots of supporting infrastructure like, you know, super PACs, and just the average person passing stuff along.
Are you seeing it on both sides of the partisan divide?
You know, I think the trend has been, with Trump in particular, of course, that he himself is a really notable source of false and misleading information. And when you have somebody as the nominee who is so willing to say things that are not true and deny things that are true, that often takes hold. And so, you know, is it present on both? Yes. Do we see a bit of a difference between them? Yes, absolutely. I mean, Trump is unlike any other candidate you've seen in the US. One of the things that was kind of interesting is after Trump won, of course, everyone worried, well, if he doesn't win, are we going to see the election denying the false claims of fraud? So he wins, and there are some claims of concerns about fraud, and there are some claims that something went wrong, but this time they're coming from the left. They're not coming from the right. And so people who were just unwilling to accept that Trump had won started sort of spinning up their own theories of, oh, you know, there are lots of, you know, 20 million uncounted votes or things like this that were not true, but they came more from the left. And I think it's important to point out, it was not coming from the Harris campaign. It was not coming from, you know, party leaders, as we saw back in 2020 with the Republicans. But it did sort of go at a grassroots level of people who are Harris supporters saying, no, 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 there was fraud and we can't accept this.
We have a tweet from after the U.S. election that you pointed us to, Craig. And if you read it, you know, Arizona officials have been caught changing ballots. Wow. Both of these supporters putting this out there, both from two different sides of the campaign.
That's exactly it. I mean, you've got somebody who is a conservative account on Twitter who is saying, yeah, there's fraud in Arizona. In their case, they're concerned about the Senate race where the Democratic candidate ended up winning. And they're saying, no, 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 it's fraud. And then you have the other person tweeting, a Harris supporter, and they're talking about the presidential, saying, no, 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 there's fraud in Arizona. Harris must have won Arizona. And so word for word, the same tweet coming from the same sides, really playing to the emotions and the existing beliefs and what people want to be true for their side. And this is a fundamental element of all of this, is playing to our bias, playing to our beliefs and our emotions. That is what works in terms of false and misleading content.
Yeah, but you had to be watching down south.
Yeah, oh my goodness. I love that you said that, because whenever people talk about misinformation and how do we fix this problem, they always talk about the supply side. You know, where is it coming from? How are platforms enabling it? But there's also a demand side, right? Either at an individual level, behavioral, cognitive level, or a societal, cultural level. Why is it that certain groups are maybe predisposed to believing something or sharing something? And I think we really need to take that into consideration. Why is that happening? And I think about this a lot in terms of the social vulnerabilities, the social wedge issues that drive communities apart, and how those can be used either by the right or the left to then create false and misleading, you know, narratives, but they feel real because that there's something that's hitting home, right? And so a lot of this I think about, I like the opening segment because there's a history of misinformation. This is not new. And when I think about the 2016 US presidential election, when the Russian interference was happening and a lot of it was targeted at Black Americans who were clearly dissatisfied with the democracy, with what was happening in the US, that's not new. In World War II, Nazis did something similar. They targeted Black Americans and racism, and it was an absolute embarrassment for the U.S. back then. So I love that you bring out the point. There's something in it, either individually, culturally, or socially, that's also driving misinformation. It's not just supply side.
I was reading an Ipsos poll from October that said many Trump voters had wrong data on inflation and crime. Those are massive voting issues. So the question for you, Craig, is did that work in this election to who is now the president of the United States?
Yeah, look, I mean, one of the things I think we always should keep in mind around elections is that most people are not super interested in politics. Most people go about their lives, they're just living it. An election comes around, and yes, maybe they're going to vote, but they may not be really set on it, and they may not be consuming information around the election. And so the fact that people might be misinformed about some key issues is probably not super surprising, but of course, playing to that, if you are a particular party, and emphasizing that becomes an important part of the strategy. And there are some anecdotal examples after the election of people who, for example, may have voted for Trump and now suddenly they learn that, oh wait, tariffs may actually cause me to have to pay more. I thought it was going to be, the manufacturers in China that were going to pay more. And so, we have more information available to us than ever before, a wonderful, more open, abundant environment, but it is still really hard for people to be informed.
Yeah.
And there are, and that's not to say that mainstream media in the older environment was doing a great job. There have always been failures and flaws, as we saw in that lead-in piece of, area of yellow journalism, of sensationalism. And so it's tough to say, did someone's wrong belief about a particular issue make them vote one way or another? But it's absolutely true that there are misinformed voters who are going to the polls. And, that's not, I think, any one person or institution's fault. It is a reality, and it's something that I think we want to look at and think about. How do we provide information for people where they need it in ways they can get it?
Something we have to pay attention to. Gabby, you're looking at the other side of the world. Okay, so tell me in Southeast Asia, where you're seeing misinformation and disinformation on display.
Yeah, so I've been following my family's from Malaysia, so I often look at Malaysia. But more recently, so Indonesia had a big general election a couple years ago. Philippines had a really big one. And both of those elections in the Philippines and Indonesia, rife. It's the same with the U.S., right? It's like you said, it's baked into the system now. The question isn't even, was there? It is there.
So how is it there?
So with the Indonesian election, it's really fascinating because if you look at the top line disinfo, it's often not necessarily like outright false or misleading information, but the narrative itself can be false. So you have Prabowo, who is, he's got a long history of human rights abuses, allegations of disappearing people who are still missing to this day, killing people, torture. And yet he has somehow had his entire image remade into that of a cuddly, warm grandfather.
We have a picture of that. I'm going to bring that up for all of our viewers out there. Take a look. I mean, this is something where this general was on billboards, stickers, sweatshirts, and TikTok with 19 billion views of this cuddly AI image, which is very different from the person that has, represented in the military for years. Is that deceptive, or is that just playing politics?
This is the hard part. Back to it being baked in. It's smart politics in a way. I'm not advocating for this guy, but it's really smart. Like, his team knew what to do, and they targeted Gen Z, they targeted millennials. Majority of these people who do not remember the past, his past, did not live through it, and so for them, they were able to take this essentially like human rights abusing dictator at one point, this general, and transform him. They started calling him Gamoy, which means cuddly or cute. And then it became a TikTok trend. It became a trend on every platform possible. He started adopting it himself. He would do the dances that were popularized on TikTok at his campaigns. And then his followers would then do the dances, and then those would get viral. So there was this suddenly real life and online world that started mimicking each other into what really helped his campaign.
I want to touch on the Philippines because Duterte was so well known around the world. His campaign is Rise to Power. Cyber troopers were a part of that campaign, right?
I love the term cyber troopers because it's got such a Southeast Asian home. Like, I feel like I can't prove this for real, but I really think the term cyber troopers emerged out of Malaysia and the Philippines and Indonesia, and it can be paid. You can.
And what are they? Just for
Yeah. So essentially, like any online agent, let's say, or group of agents who are they're promoting one political agenda or one politician, but they do it with a fervor, and it's often coordinated. There are allegations of who's paying who and what politicians are paying what, but often they're totally organic. You know, I think the left and the right like to accuse each other of paying for these cyber troopers, these trolls, these online hordes, but honestly, sometimes they're just truly fervent believers who are, like in Duterte's case, the DDS, Duterte diehard supporters. There's a mass of them. Yes, some of them are like gig workers, essentially getting paid per post, but there's a very loyal, hardcore fan base. And you see the same thing with the 2022 election in the Philippines, similar to Indonesia. There was a whole rebranding of Ferdinand Marcos, totally sanitizing his history's past, where again, human rights abuses, disappearances, torture, murder of like thousands, and yet somehow that was all ignored by a vast majority, and a landslide victory for Ferdinand Marcos. Same with Prabowo, landslide victory, like decisive victories for both.
You know, I have to think about Canada and the fact that we're coming towards a provincial election, a federal election, not far away. What do people need to know out there as they're consuming information, Craig?
You know, I think whether it's one with an election is there's a much more focused attention and energy, and so the stakes are higher, and that's why you often see a lot more people trying to spread false or misleading information, or just trying to rebrand or create things that feel fun and participatory. And so I think the first thing for people is just like be aware that in these mass attention gathering events, you have lots of different people coming to play. So yeah, you might have paid operatives who are doing things, really big, genuine, diehard fans, the candidates, the parties themselves, and also casual people. And this whole kind of stew is focused around certain types of topics. And so you end up having more energy, more false, more misleading, and also, you know, good information as well. And so just be aware of that. And then don't rush. I would say just like take your time in when you consume, especially if you feel a strong emotional reaction to something you're seeing or reading. That's actually the best time to not share and to not take some kind of activity to help propel it along. Sit back and think about it. Where did this come from? You know, why did I have such a strong reaction? So just being aware of that environment and the stakes being higher and how to sort of slow yourself down, those are really good starting points for not sort of going off on a tangent.
Keep calm. Okay, Gabby, I have 1 minute, but how do people protect themselves when so much is coming at them?
Even though I think it's the system that's fault, just kidding. I'll go after that in a different segment. I think what you said is right. Keep calm. I think have a variety of friends. Like have friends who can check you and who aren't afraid to check you. One of my favorites is whenever you see false or misleading content online, you read the comments. People do check themselves. People do check each other. But you have to make sure your friend group is fairly diverse in order to do that, which isn't always the case. We talk about echo chambers and filter bubbles, but being aware of those things, I think, is really important.
Diversify the friendship group. Take a listen. If everyone's thinking the same, talking the same, maybe you need some new friends.
Broaden it. Don't ditch people, but broaden it. Yes.
Broaden the group out. Craig, Gabby, such an important conversation. This is a huge conversation that I'm sure we will continue on our show, but this is the start.
At length. Yeah. Oh my goodness.
Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.